Okay, I'm here with Anise Kavanaugh, who joined us for Bo's interview, and we're going to chat shortly after this quick intro for Bo's interview. We just sat down with him, or I just sat down with him. Anise was in the background, and Bo is such a wealth of knowledge and stories. What a storyteller and an amazing person. What were your insights that you took away being kind of in the background?
I feel so lucky that I got to sit and watch that live. I love listening to you talk to anybody, and the combination of you and Bo together, I felt like I was listening to two of the most humble men I know in my life, talking about service and impact. I think for me what stood out was just if I had only a couple words to use for Bo, it'd be legacy, love, service, and respect.
That's
right.
That's
just
perfect. So perfect.
That's him. Legacy, love, service, respect. That's Bo. So thank you for letting me sit in on that.
Yeah. Well, I wondered, was there anything that stuck out for you in anything that he said? And something that kind of was like, if somebody said, well, give me a nugget or something. Yeah.
Well, there was a ton. I mean, I took 2 pages of notes, of course, and they're totally a mess. I won't be able to read them later. I think, one of the things was this piece around his book, Finish Big. And when he looked at the differences in the people after they'd exited, who was really happy and who was miserable. At the end of the day, the difference was always the people that stayed in service of something, that stayed connected to purpose. Yeah. They stayed happy. Yeah. And if they lost connection with that, they were miserable after they sold it, no matter how much money they made. I think for me, that was like...
Yeah, that is a nugget. Good one. Well, I hope you enjoy my chat with Bo and Anise. What a pleasure to be with you.
Thank
so
you.
Grateful that you're here.
Thank you.
Can't wait to talk to you later.
That was beautiful. It was very rich. Very rich.
Enjoy the conversation, everybody. Bo, thank you for joining me on the Do Nothing podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure.
I'm so happy to be with you, first of all.
Yeah.
It's always the best.
Yeah, it's always great.
I can spend some time with you. And we're here in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. You didn't have to come too far, which is good, but the traffic took a while, and we had a snafu. New thing, the driver who's supposed to pick you up overslept.
Right.
But you handled it perfectly and just got a lift.
Yeah.
So I'm curious over the years how things have changed for you. And really, nowadays, how do you go about your days?
Well, let me
share a little bit about your days.
That requires me to go back and think about how my day used to be.
Right.
And frankly, my days are totally dictated by whatever it is that I'm working on at the time.
Yeah.
So if I'm working on a book, I sort of get started, I don't know, about 9:30, something like that. And then I'll work straight through. And I find it very hard to stay concentrating that whole time, so I take breaks. And now I'm not working on a book right now, or at least I've got sort of 2 books that I'm sort of thinking about doing. But meanwhile, I still do the column with Norm Brodsky, and and then there are various other things. People are always asking me to do things, so I wind up spending an inordinate amount of time writing forewords for people.
It's funny, I actually had a question about that, because you were, first of all, you did the foreword for my book, which I'll always be, so grateful to you for doing that, because I know how busy you are. And I thought about that people had asked you to do things like this, and I wondered how you feel about it, and I wondered if it's hard for you to say no.
It's very hard for me to say no. Now, with you, Rob, I would never say no.
Thank you.
There are some people who I say yes to, and then when I actually sit down and I have to actually say something and have hopefully have an original thought, I think, why did I ever agree to this? But I'm happy to do it. If I'm not doing anything else, I got to stay off the streets,
Yeah.
So I go ahead. I do have a hard time saying no. You're right. And unfortunately, I ought to think a little bit more about what the subject is going to be.
Where do you feel most engaged these days? Where you feel excited and you really feel you want to learn or do whatever it is that you're doing?
Well, I have somehow I've written these books and there have been these organizations that have sort of grown up around them, and so I still do stuff for Jack Stack and the Great Game Business people, and of course I try to be somewhat helpful to Hamza, not that she needs it, and and then we always do, or we've been doing the annual Small Giants list, which we've done now for 4 years, and I imagine we're going to do it again. And then the latest thing is actually is some people who want to do something, if you can believe it, around Finish Big. They want to set up a Finish Big initiative. That's what they're calling it.
Okay.
And I have no idea what that involves. I just said, yeah, sure, go ahead. I'm happy to, tell me what you want me to do. And so far, all they wanted me to do was to show up and do an interview with the woman who is really, and she knows a lot more than I do about this subject. And she asked me to do an interview with her, so I did that. Her name is Allie Taylor, and her idea is to establish, I think, sort of groups around the country of people who are in business and sort of have gotten to the point where they realize that they're not going to live forever, and that sooner or later they're going to have to leave. I mean, even Ari had to sort of come to that point, and and sort of make plans. And so I've encouraged her and just asked her, to tell me what she wants me to do. So far, she hasn't asked me to do very much. She's working with. There is an organization in northeast Ohio, sort of near Akron, between Akron and Cleveland, called Legacy Partners, which has done some very interesting work around trying to set up these. I mean, I've always thought that, for people who are actually, at the point where they're thinking seriously about, okay, what am I going to do here? That it's very important to have a group of peers who have either been through that themselves or are struggling with it at the time. And, when I've seen that happen, it's been very, very beneficial to them because, they're talking about extremely personal things and extremely personal issues. And that they really don't have anybody else to talk to about it, or anybody else who really understands what it is that they're dealing with.
Yeah, it's
Um,
unique.
Because, you spend 10 or 15 or 20 years of your life building a business, and there are all kinds of questions about, do you want this business to last after you? Do you have an idea of what you want the business to be like after you? Or don't you care? Do you want to sell it and make as much money as you can? I don't criticize anybody for that.
Mm-hmm.
Or, what do you really want to do? And are your children in the picture? And if so, how do you prepare to bring them into the business? And so there are all these extremely personal issues that business owners have to deal with when they get to that phase of their journey, which, most people wait way too long to start thinking about that. They wait until they think, okay, well, I'm ready to do it. They call up their lawyer, their accountant, and say, okay, well, I'm ready to sell a business. And the lawyer, the accountant says, okay, well, when? And they say, well, I don't know, 6 months. And, it's really, when I wrote Finish Big, it was very clear to me when I started my interviewing that an incredibly large percentage, over 50%, of the people who had actually sold their businesses and left their businesses were unhappy. They were filled with regrets. They didn't know who they were anymore. They didn't know, people would ask them, what do you do? And they didn't know how to answer it. And they had to somehow, it often took years and years for them to sort of figure out what exactly they were going to do afterwards, because they lost everything. I mean, even if they got a lot of money, they're still in a situation where they used to have, people would ask them what they do, and they'd have a sense of identity, a sense of purpose. They'd be able to answer the question. They were doing it with people who they had seen every day for years, and suddenly those people aren't around anymore, or at least they don't have any relationship to them anymore. They sort of feel lost in the sense that there are things you get from business that you're not aware of until you don't have them anymore, like a sense of progress, a sense that you're going forward. Well, business sort of tells you that, so there's something you can look at from year to year and sort of see how you're doing. Well, what if you don't have that anymore? And, it also sort of gives you a structure to your life in that, the business sort of tells you what's the next thing you have to do. You wake up in the morning and there's something you have to do, and you have some idea about what that is. Well, waking up in the morning and not having any idea, where you can basically do anything, that's not freedom. That's actually, that can get very old very quickly.
Yeah.
And so, I have been encouraging Allie and the folks in Akron, to go forward with this progress, because I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do, particularly now when, all of us baby boomers are getting to an age where, like it or not, we realize we're not going to live forever, and that sooner or later we're going to have to leave, and we're going to have to move on to something else. And you know, I can really, I'm in a situation now where I can really identify with these people because, you know, a lot of what I was doing, you know, I don't really have anymore. I mean, I stopped working for Inc. in order to go and do the Small Giants stuff for Forbes. And really what I was doing was choosing Lauren Feldman, who'd actually been my editor at Inc. and who I felt very loyal to and I felt was a very, very good editor. He'd gone from Inc. to the New York Times and then had been recruited by Forbes to set up their small business and entrepreneurship section, which they were horrible at. And he recruited me to come and do this the Small Giants package for them. And that was fine until he decided to leave. The problem was that they had made a bunch of commitments to him. This also happened in the New York Times, frankly. They'd made a bunch of commitments to him about, he had a vision of what he wanted to do, and then there was a change in the leadership at Forbes, and they suddenly changed everything. He had a whole staff that he was working with. They took away his staff. You know, he realized that none of the things that he'd been promised were in fact going to be delivered, and so that he better start looking for something else to do. And, you know, I understood that, and
Sure.
I supported him in that. But meanwhile, he's still sort of figuring out what he's doing. And I told him I'll help him once he figures it out and tells me what he wants. But I don't really, you know, I have a very sort of distant relationship with Forbes right now. Because, you know, the major thing, the thing that I was doing for them was all this sort of Small Giants related stuff, and I don't think they really get Small Giants. The thing that has got their attention is that advertisers get it, and that there have been a number of advertisers, including Capital One, including American Express and so forth, that get the idea and that think, oh, this is a great idea, we should do something with it, and they're willing to spend millions of dollars in order to get it. And well, the millions of dollars catches Forbes's attention, and so we've kept doing it, and we'll see how far we go with it. I don't know. Meanwhile, I'm hoping that Lauren will get his act together at Advantage Media, where he is right now, and that I can begin doing something with him there.
Oh, that's so cool. Back to the book.
Yeah.
I actually had a friend who used the book to help him exit his company.
Oh, really?
And
I hope he had a good exit.
he did.
Oh,
He
good,
did.
good.
And your book was really helpful.
Oh, good.
I also started to notice some people that I knew in the wealth management space that were starting to give away the book to their clients that were entrepreneurs.
That's how it winds up. That's how it's been sold.
Is that right?
I didn't know that before. I mean, obviously, I wrote the book for the people I always write for, which are entrepreneurs, and but you know, telling entrepreneurs that it's sort of like selling them funeral services or burial services or something like that. It's like they really don't want to talk about that, and they really are reluctant. You know, when you raise the subject of exits, it tends to be a reluctance. You know, I've got so many things on my plate right now. I'll deal with that when I have to. And so the people who actually have been selling the book have been people like your friends in wealth management, or actually wealth management has been a prime avenue for me because, or for the book, because they recognize that their future really is going to be shaped by all these people who are who have, on paper they're worth a lot of money, but it's all on paper, and until they actually they don't really have much wealth to manage, but they will at some point. And so I can understand why, if I were a wealth manager and I had a bunch of these people who I was looking to as my future source of income, that I'd want to encourage them by, reading a book about how you do it.
I thought when you were writing it that, you have a real visionary way about you. Who could have thought when you did Small Giants that it would have opened up all these entrepreneurs' minds to what could be and what was out there, myself included.
Yeah.
And then you had this idea for Finish Big,
Right.
which I feel like is similar in a way, because you're sort of through the stories, you're sharing the experiences, and it's opening up minds again.
Yeah.
I wondered if you ever reflect on those.
Well, I have to say, looking back, in retrospect, I can see it. It's sort of an accident that it happens. I mean, it's the sort of thing that, gets me engaged and excited about writing a book. In other words, if I can see how it really has the potential to change the way people look at things, then I feel like I have something to contribute. And I just ran into this. There's Dave Warden, who you know.
Sure.
Dave Warden is the founder. Well, he's a guy who really grew up in the venture capital business, and he was, he had a sterling history where he worked for Kleiner Perkins. He was actually John Doerr, who is one of the top venture capitalists ever. He was his right-hand man, and so while Kleiner Perkins was, investing in Amazon, investing in Google, investing in all these companies, Dave was sort of right there, sort of helping to advise them and on how to do it and what to do, and serving as a liaison and all kinds of other things. And so he'd done this for years, and he got to a point where it was sort of accidental. That one of the women who he had invested in when he was at Kleiner Perkins was, I'm going to forget her name. Her name is Jessica. She's Stella and Dot is her company.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to him and basically said that she was starting this company, Stella and Dot, and that this was long after the first one that he'd done was was basically essentially a version of weddings.com. It was like, it was at a time when there were all these .coms being founded because people would, click and say, well, gee, this we could do online. So why not have like wedding directories online? So she, that was the business that he had encouraged her when he was a client at Perkins. He encouraged to bring to them, and that eventually, she started that business, eventually it merged with a bunch of other businesses, and there's some version of it still around, but this was much, much later when she had this idea. She said she felt she learned a lot from, going through that whole private equity process, but she was interested in building something that was really going to last for a while. And what she found was, in the venture capital world, as soon as you actually have a viable business, everybody's looking to figure out how they're going to cash out on it. And sometimes that happens even before you have a viable business. And she felt, that had happened with her, basically her weddings.com startup, and she felt, she felt, I don't know, she didn't really feel all that comfortable with it. And so she wanted to start a company that in fact, would actually be a good company and that would actually do something positive in the world. And she came up with this idea for basically a jewelry business that was going to involve a lot of home selling and that would allow a lot of women all over the world to support themselves. And it was it was a good idea for a business, as history subsequently showed. And she went to Dave and basically told Dave about her idea, and he said to her, so, what's your exit plan? How are you going to get out of this? And and she said, oh, no, I don't have an exit plan. I'm going to be rolled out on a gurney. And he said, oh, so it's going to be a lifestyle business. She got very insulted by that. He said, no, it's not a lifestyle business. This is going to be a really big company. And he said, well, if I put money in, how do I get paid back if you're not going to sell it or anything, or go public? And she said, well, we'll pay you back out of dividends. We'll make money and we'll pay you that way. And so he thought this was intriguing enough that he actually put his own money into the company and sort of watched it. There were other former Kleiner Perkins people who put their personal money into this company, and Stella and Dot over the next few years proceeded to grow and become a very, very substantial company. It was like, hundreds of millions of dollars it was doing, and it really had a base and had a whole lot of followers, a lot of women who really got involved in this, and he was fascinated by this. He didn't really know that you could do this. And so at some point he went to her and said, Jessica, do you know other people who are thinking about doing this? I find it sort of interesting what you've been able to do here. She said, well, I do know people, a lot of them in Silicon Valley, but who would rather do a business like this than the typical, what had become sort of the typical way of building a company in the Valley. And so he said to her, can you give me some references? So she gave him some references, and he began going around looking and seeing if there were really other companies like this. And the more he talked, he eventually followed it. He began talking to all kinds of other businesses around, and he enjoyed talking to them. He said it was very different from the conversations he would have in the valley, because in the valley, basically all the conversations were about money. I mean, if there were people coming to you, they wanted to know about the money, and everybody else was wondering, well, how are you going to pay off this money? And it was all about money. And when he went around and talked to these other companies, they didn't talk about the money. They talked about their people, and their employees, and their customers, and they weren't really thinking about cashing out.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, in fact, had been around for a long, long time, and were mainly sort of family businesses who have been passed from one generation to the other. So he became very interested in this, and he decided, he said, well, maybe some of these people who I've talked to, I find this fascinating. He said, maybe I should ask them to come and join me. And, it was a similar situation as with Small Giants, where he would go and talk to these people, and then he'd talk about getting them together. And all these people felt, oh, I thought I was the only one who was doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know anybody else was doing it. Well, in fact, there were quite a few people who were sort of taking the same approach to business. And so he invited them to Sun Valley, where he lived. One of his homes was in Sun Valley. And, he thought he'd get 15 or 20 people, wound up getting about 50. And they had a really good time together in terms of talking about what they were doing, what they did in common, how are they comparable. And I would say that the essential thing about it, which is a little different from Small Giants, similar to Small Giants, but was that he was very focused on building companies that were going to last a long, long time. And he had a partner at the time, and they thought about it, and they said, well, what do we call these companies? And they sort of racked their brain and said, well, they're sort of evergreen companies. In other words, they're companies that are built, and the idea is they're going to last and last and last. And that was interesting. And he said, well, and they came up with a list of, well, what do these things have in common? He came up with a list that he calls the 7 Ps,
Mm-hmm.
which are things like that these are private companies, that they have like paced growth. In other words, they're not trying to get as big as possible, as fast as possible. There's a lot of very similarities to Small Giants,
Mm-hmm.
although he was looking for companies that a lot of companies that had gotten a lot bigger and were their bigger companies that had sort of had the same ethos. And he found them, and he became very, very, it's almost like for him, it was like a revelation for him that this was out there. Now, of course, my perspective on it was a little different because I'd never been to Silicon Valley, and I knew a lot of companies that actually fit this mold. And so at some point he reached out to me, and I went down to see him in Palo Alto, and we had a very nice talk together, and I talked to him about some of the companies that have been in Small Giants that I felt sort of fit his model. And I asked him if he knew of this company in Springfield, Missouri, and if he'd ever read The Great Game of Business. And he was like, no, I've never What is that? And so I told him what it was and about all of that. And he said, I said, I think you'd be very interested in it. I think you ought to read it. So next thing I know, and then I left and I went home, and next thing I know, he was in Springfield. It was like he read the book and got in a plane and flew to Springfield, and he was there, and he was extremely enthusiastic about it. Well, you've been through that, as have I, and so he realized that this was something, and by then SRC, which was a small company starting out, was up to $750 million, and had done it while sort of retaining the same spirit that it had in its early days, that it was really sort of breaking new ground in terms of obviously getting all the employees involved in understanding and tracking and dealing with the financials of the business, basically running the business. And so he was very taken with that, and we wound up being in touch. And after a while, I did, as you may recall, I wrote an article on him for a magazine, and unfortunately it appeared in an issue, and the person on the cover was the next Steve Jobs, a woman.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it was.
What's her name? The blood.
Yes. What is this?
Yeah. Yes. We'll it'll come to us. Yeah.
And 2 weeks later, John Carreyrou, who was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, came out with an article saying that this company, which by then was, it was it was a unicorn. It was valued at billions of dollars.
Theranos? Is that what it was called? Theranos, the company?
Theranos.
Uh-huh.
Elizabeth Holmes.
There you go.
That's her name.
Yeah.
And she was the cover of it. I mean, and I had hoped that, in fact, Jessica would be on the cover, but ink was very taken, I guess. With
at the time, she
was hot.
Yeah,
and
she was on the cover of everything.
Yeah, and so I wrote this article, and it really was about it was about Dave and about the company, some of the companies that were involved in this, and this whole idea of actually building a company that's going to be around 100 years from now, which I don't know if that's still a common, at the time it was very new. It was like, this was like 2015, and it was like, so the article came out, and there were actually a lot of people who read it and thought, yeah, that's the kind of company I want to have. And so they contacted Dave, and they became part of this group that he was forming. And he had started a venture capital company that he called Tugboat, and because his idea was that he was going to invest in early stage startups and sort of be with them as they were growing. Well, he basically got to a point where he was a lot more interested in these other companies than he was in the companies in his own portfolio, and so he he established what he called the Tugboat Institute, which sort of brought all these companies together. And as time went along, he got more and more focused on them, and he spent more and more time seeking them out, finding new ones, inviting them to become part of this organization. I thought there was a book there. So, but, and in fact, I was thinking of it as sort of like, I don't know if you ever read The New Thing by Michael Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Lewis is one of my favorite writers, and he did a brilliant job on that book, although it didn't get the kind of attention that some of his other books have gotten. And it followed, a venture capitalist essentially, because his question was, it came out at a time when people really didn't understand what was going on in Silicon Valley. And so he wrote this book, and it was, I loved it. I read it and I enjoyed it, and I thought, maybe I could do something that's sort of like that, except do it for Dave and around Dave. And so I was working on that, and I got to a point where I was sort of stuck. And this sort of comes back in a long way to the question that you raised before. It was like, what do I have to say here? Once I can tell this story about Dave, which is very interesting, and how he got to this point, but then what? Then what do I write about? Do I write about all these different companies? Well, I've already sort of written about a lot of them. Or similar companies in Small Giants, and I don't know, that's not really much of I wouldn't have that role of sort of making people aware of something that they didn't know already, which I think was, in fact, when I look back at the books that I'd written, that's what the Great Game Business had done. That's what Small Giants had done. And to a certain extent, that's also what Finish Big had done. In other words, it was like, I developed a philosophy actually about this. I said that the secret to writing a successful book is that you tell people things they already know, but that a lot of people are telling them they're stupid to think it. But in their hearts, they already know it. So when the Great Game Business came out, there were a lot of people who were thinking, wouldn't this be easier if everybody sort of understood and was involved in this? Why am I, Jack came along, in the Great Game Business, and basically said, yeah, this is in fact a very sensible way to run a business. When Small Giants came out, there were a lot of people around. You're a prime example, who were building businesses, and there was something about the traditional model that was out there that didn't really sit right with them. And basically what Small Giants said was, well, you don't have to follow the traditional model. There are other ways to do this. And here are some examples of companies that have done it. And here are the things that they have in common, and so forth. And I think that the effect it had was sort of similar to what Small Giants had on you, Rob, you and Joel, which was, I'd feel better about building this company if we did it sort of this way. And that was, with Finish Big, it was, the revelation I had was when I went out and started interviewing people, was how many of them were miserable after they'd sold their companies. Even if they got a lot of money, they were still miserable. And so my question was, well, what's the difference between the ones who are happy afterwards and the ones who are miserable? What have they done differently? And so that's really what Finish Big was about. And so when I was looking at this book with Dave, I was thinking, I couldn't find that handle on it. And then I was talking to Dave, and we got to talking about how his thinking had evolved. And in particular, he would go and see companies, and he would raise questions that the people themselves really had never thought about and weren't particularly interested in. I mean, he would be, because he was coming at it from his background in private equity and venture capital. And the questions that had been important to ask in that context were not important, or were dealt with in an entirely different way in this other context. And so I thought, you know what? This should be a book in Dave's voice, not in my voice. And so I've been talking to him about that, and we're going to help him with that.
Oh, interesting.
It reminds me a lot of sort of what happened with Jack Stack as well.
Yeah.
And sort of knowing when to do this. When do you want to write about people, and when do you just want to give voice to them?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there are people who have what I think are important things to say, but for whatever reason don't really have the means to do it. And so if I can come in and sort of help them do it, that's a worthwhile use of my time.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know how we got.
No, it was great. I mean, you know what Dave's doing with, does he go by Tugboat Institute, or is it the Evergreen?
No, it's the Tugboat Institute, but the companies are Evergreen companies.
They're Evergreen companies. You know, I was thinking when you were talking about the book, the potential of this book, the message. This is just something I'm wondering about. That you can actually go get investors nowadays, and even some private equity firms that are getting more focused on finding evergreen companies that pay dividends and are not as focused on the exit. They're focused on the health and the ongoing dividend that you're receiving from it.
Well, this is true, and an interesting subject, very interesting subject that I've been very interested in, because the problem, remember the article I wrote about cue ball for Forbes?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem, I learned a lot from writing that article, because they are a very unconventional venture capital company. And what I learned was, I got some insight into exactly how a private equity firm works, how do they make money. And I realized that, you know, the way private equity firms are set up, they get money from investors, and the deal they have with investors, in almost all cases, is, okay, we're going to pay you back in X amount of time. And they have to deliver on that. If that is the business that you're in, who are the customers? The customers are your investors. The people who you're investing in, the companies that you're investing in, they're not the customers. They're the raw material.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, what, when push comes to shove, when you have to make a decision about somebody in your portfolio, you, if there's a conflict between what might be right for that company and what would be right for your investors, well, you have to do what's right for your investors or you'll go out of business.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't understand this because, obviously when entrepreneurs are going to private equity for financing, well, they're not the only ones who are trying to sell themselves to the private equity. Private equity people are also trying to sell themselves to the company, and so they sweet talk them and talk about what a wonderful company they have and how,
Partnership.
Yeah, we're going to be your partner here, and we're all going to really move. The potential of this company is so great, and so forth, and they make it sound like you're going to be their partner. You're going to be their, they're going to do things good for you, but they never really say. But of course, you have to understand, we really have to do things good for our investors, and so the entrepreneurs who own these companies, they don't realize what exactly they're getting into, and the result is that they are very likely to have some bad surprises later on. And so cue ball
In Boston.
Yep. Is a venture capital company that has a different model. In other words, they decided to set up a fund. They didn't intend to be a venture capital company when they started out. They thought like a lot of people, they thought they were going to found the next Berkshire Hathaway. And Warren Buffett's company. And that they were going to invest in great companies and they were just going to leave their money there indefinitely. Well, that's a great idea, but what's the money you're going to actually put into those companies? Well, you got to get it from somewhere. You got to get it from investors. So you go to those investors and you say, we're going to put this money into great companies and we're going to leave it there forever. And the investors say, well, how do we get our money back? And they say, oh, well, they'll pay dividends or whatever, but you have to actually persuade them that even though there's no time limit on this, that you've got things set up in a way where eventually they'll be able to get their money out.
Mm-hmm.
But that involves a whole different way of setting up the fund, a whole different way of dealing with the investors, and a whole different, because you do have to give them an opportunity, the investors an opportunity to take their money out, because they need it, because their money usually comes from somebody else. And so Q-Ball did that, and I looked around, and there are some other private equity funds that are exploring similar ways of investing in these companies. And they call themselves, actually there are some funds that actually call themselves Evergreen funds.
Yeah.
And some of them are pretty big. There's one called General Atlantic, which is actually a very big company.
Mm-hmm.
That I believe is an evergreen fund. I don't, and then the other thing is that there are family offices out there. Now, family offices are basically rich people who have lots of money. The family has lots of money. So they set up what's called the family office. Now, the family office, they're looking for some place to put their money, and if it stays out there for a long time, that's fine, as long as it's growing, as long as the value's growing. And so you have this, now a lot of family offices out there that, you know, that are where if you can find a good one, they'll agree to terms that you probably can't get from a lot of private equity companies. And in fact, Dave again wanted to set up some sort of a financial mechanism to help these evergreen companies. And what he had in mind was not a fund, but a network. In other words, that if an evergreen company needed money to do something, there was a network of family offices and rich individuals and so forth that he had set up, that, you know, he could put this opportunity in front of them, and then those that were interested in it could invest. But the deal would be that you're going to put the money in and you're going to leave it there. You're not taking it out.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and in fact, there's a lot of sense to that. I mean, Warren Buffett says, if you've got a good investment, the best time to hold it is forever. Why would you take it out? If you've got a good investment someplace, why would you take it out? I mean, unless it stops being a good investment. If it becomes a bad investment, then of course you would want to take it out. But
I wonder if there's, you know, you can look at the market as a whole, like what Buffett does, and you can see what the trends have been and feel confident in that. But when you're going to a private company and doing the same thing, you, without probably a lot of data around it, it's probably not even available. You got to hope your returns, your dividends are going to be higher than just going in the conventional
absolutely,
way.
yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder too if, especially the way things are nowadays, if it's hard to go down the evergreen route in terms of investing because the multiples are ridiculous right now. I mean, if you're trying to grow your money, not necessarily just from your heart, it's hard to ignore what some of these companies are getting.
How do you mean?
If you're a private equity company or a family office, investing in some of these companies where they hardly have any revenue, but they're selling for 10 times, 20 times.
Yeah, well, there's that,
you know,
which is a certain craziness involved.
That's what I'm saying, but it's hard to look away from that when you're investing money.
Well, if you're smart, you look away from that.
Well, yeah, that's true.
But, you know, basically, when you get those kind of multiples, you know, the unicorn type multiples, you really do have to eventually go public. I mean, because there's no way you're going to be able to raise the kind of, I mean, look at what's happened in the last 6 months in terms of Lyft, Uber, and all these other companies, the super foods or whatever it is.
But those are more well known. I mean, I have some insight on some of these quote unquote smaller companies. There's one that I know of that has this digital platform. I can't explain exactly what they do. They were doing about $7 million in sales, and they sold 65% of the company for $70 million to a private equity company.
Well, I understand the temptation of the opportunity to sell for that amount of money, but, you know, and if that's why you're in business, I mean, you know, ultimately it all comes back to the same question, which is, why are you in business? I mean, if this is how you're spending, why are you doing it? I mean, you know, if you're doing it to get rich, okay, that's one way to go about it. But a lot of people, as you know, go into business not because they're serving something, and that a big part of it is service. They're serving this is something that I found in Finish Big, is that when I looked at the ones who ultimately had very positive exits and felt good about it, when I look at what they had in common, they were almost all involved in serving other entrepreneurs. In other words, they'd they were helping entrepreneurs grow their businesses, and in many cases steer them through the exit and so forth. And then when I thought about that, I thought, well, what is business? If business is certainly a way to make a lot of money, if that's your goal. But in fact, in order to have a successful company, you've got to be, at the very least, you've got to be serving your customers, because if you're not serving your customers, you're not going to be in business. You're serving your family as well. You're many cases serving your employees. You're serving your community because you're living in it, and your taxes are going to build it. So there's really all this service involved, and when people actually talk about purpose, in other words, why do they have this? What do they do? Really what they're talking about is, who are you serving? And that's what you lose when you sell your business, is that suddenly you don't know who you're serving anymore. That's why when people ask me how they should prepare psychologically for the exit, I say, well, think about who you're going to be serving, or who you can serve afterwards. Figure out something that you're going to do. The goal is to find something that you're going to do that you can become as engaged in, as committed to, as you were to your business. And some people are much better at that. That's not the easiest thing to do, but some people are much better at it than others. I mean, I have one friend who basically, he is the founder of a company called TriNet, which is right now very successful, what's called a PEO, a professional employer organization, and it's public. But he's still on the board, but basically he decided that once it was done, even while he was working at the company, he had these other projects that he was involved in. Well, one of them is that he's from upstate New York. Now, upstate New York is a very sort of backward economic area. He decided that he wanted to go and revive upstate New York. So he's done that. He has a whole organization that he's set up about. Well, he's very committed. He's one of those people who feels that entrepreneurship can save the world, and he's interested in doing that in underdeveloped countries. So he's got another organization that is focused on Jamaica. And he's got all of these different things that he's doing, and he knew he was going to do that before he ever stepped out of TriNet. And if you can do that, if you can find some place to put your passion, aside from your business, then you have a future.
You know, over the years, you've obviously become masterful at telling other people's stories. And many people don't know a lot about your story, which quite frankly could be a movie. And you talked about service. There was service in your family growing up. Your mom,
Yeah.
very involved in the community.
Yeah.
Eleanor?
Yeah, Eleanor,
Yeah.
that's right. You know too much about my past. Rob.
So what was that like, you know, at a young age, being around that service-oriented mindset?
Well, you know, I think it's like every other kid with their parents, which is that you absorb certain things, and there's a certain way of sort of looking at the world that you absorb from your parents, and if you're lucky, it's a way of looking at the world that that can sustain you later in life, even if you get off the track at times, and I got off the track at times. I mean, that is a whole other story, and it's I don't know. Doug Tatum wants me to write about it, and I talked to him, and I'm actually going to see him later today. He's been up at the Bohemian Club, and he's coming back. He's leaving tomorrow, but he's going to be in town, so we're going to have dinner, and then he's going to stay with us, and I'm sure that he'll get on my case about this.
Well, you know, everybody's dying to know now. What is this story all about?
Well, okay. Well, I was quite a radical young man. In fact, some people would say that I was a revolutionary. I was very anti-capitalism and anti-business. I actually considered myself a communist, small c, and I can't go on forever about this, but I got involved in things that led to my being under federal indictment for conspiracy to violate the Federal Firearms and Explosives Act, and ultimately that got dismissed. It got dismissed because of Watergate, frankly. The government, there's a whole story connected with that, but so that's where I was at one point. And I'd been the editor of a magazine actually out here called Ramparts, which was a very radical magazine, and then a lot happened from, you know, once that indictment against me was dismissed, I sort of had to, because I sort of had it in my head that I might well wind up going to jail, I sort of had to say, okay, well now I've got a life I have, and I mean, I by then my wife and I had a family. I mean, we had a son.
Hold on one sec. The indictment story is a great story, by the way. So, because you were already kind of starting to quote unquote get your act together, I guess, for lack of a better word, you took a job at the radio station of Boston,
Yeah,
and
well,
you were the news director.
Well, I had been in a situation where, well, there's a whole story connected. I don't know if you want to go into all of
Of course.
I I was a member of the Weatherman organization, which eventually became the Weather Underground. I was never really underground, but one of the things that we did was that we wanted to smash monogamy. Well, because that was very bourgeois and it was going to hold us back in terms of our commitment to the revolution. So while I was in the process of smashing monogamy, I met this young woman who I liked very much, and we developed a bond that was actually sort of monogamous. I was reminded that I was supposed to be smashing monogamy, but I did have this monogamous relationship. Well, make a long story short, that young woman was Lisa Mizell, and this year we're celebrating our 49th anniversary, wedding anniversary. So we didn't do a very good job of smashing monogamy. So anyway, there was, after I decided, I mean, the Weatherman organization was going underground, and it sounded like they were going to start blowing things up. And I decided I did not want to be part of that. And Lisa decided that she did not want to be part of it. So we managed to connect, which wasn't the easiest thing in the world, but and then, you know, we were being sort of hunted by the FBI around then, and at a certain point, we had to decide, well, what are we going to do, you know? At that point, we were staying at my parents' house, and the FBI had my parents' house staked out 24 hours a day. And they also had some sort of bug on the car, so whenever I'd go someplace in the car, they would be there once I got there or after I got there. So it was, you know, we had to do something, and we didn't want to stay there. We had to sort of get out of town. The question was, we thought about going to California, but we didn't have enough money to do that. I knew people in Washington, and we knew people in Boston, so we decided to go to Boston. And we managed to sort of sneak away and get up to Boston. And once we got to Boston, the question was, what are we going to do? And there was somebody who was a friend of mine, still is a friend of mine, who basically said, well, the WBCN, which was a sort of was a big, so one of the first FM rock and roll stations, they were looking for a new news director. And I said, okay, well, I'll go and interview for it, and maybe they'll give me the job. So one thing led to another, and I did get hired by WBCN. Now, I was not doing the news there very long.
They had a great slogan.
Yeah, yesterday's news tomorrow, because we were not real good at getting it all together quickly. So I you know, we started out on a Monday, and I had all these people who were sort of helping me do it voluntarily, actually. And we did a terrible job on Monday, and then we did a little bit better job on Tuesday, and then Wednesday, we were finally beginning to sort of get our act together here. And then on Thursday, we all met. I sent people out to get their assignments. And I was going to stay behind and, basically write the newscast, which somebody else was going to read. And as everybody left, the ticker tape, we had an old AP ticker tape machine, and it began sort of spitting out. It was going all the time, but it began to spit something out. And so I thought, well, let's see what they're reporting. And there was a story, and it said 13 leaders of the Weatherman organization are indicted in Detroit, Michigan. And I said, oh, well, these are people who I knew. And so they went down the list, and most of them were people I knew were underground. There were a few people I knew weren't underground. And then I got to the last name on the list, and it was mine. And I sort of tore it off. I went to see the disc jockey who I was working with to do the news, and he looked at it and said, oh shit, what are we going to do for a news director? And I said, well, actually, Charles, that's not my biggest thought at the moment. And so I had to basically hide out for a day, because I'd already decided I wasn't going underground, so I wasn't going to be a fugitive. So I eventually turned myself in. And,
There's a story where you saw an attorney and he said, just tomorrow or something, turn yourself in, but just don't get arrested in between. And you said you were at a movie, and you felt like everybody was.
Yeah, I thought everybody. I looked around. We went to see
Cotton
Comes to Harlem. And at a movie theater in Boston, and there were all these people there who were probably, I don't know, homeless or something like that, and I was convinced that everybody around was an FBI agent, and so I was constantly looking around. Well, they weren't all FBI agents, in fact, and I got out, and my friend had a motorcycle, and I rode with him, and he took me to the office of the, forget what it was, some U.S. Marshal or something like that, where I turned myself in, and then I went before a judge who basically set my bail.
Do you remember how much your bail was?
I think it was $100,000 or something like that.
That's a lot of money back then.
Well, it was, but you don't have to put up that. You go to a bail bondsman and you put up like 10% of that.
Okay.
And my parents were generous enough to put up the money, so I did get bailed out. Eventually they got the money back, but I told them I wasn't going to skip out on them, so it was a good risk.
Were your parents upset?
Now you're really getting into were my parents upset? Let me say this. Many years later, when Lisa and I were settled down in Cambridge, we went away one weekend, and when we came back, our son Jake, who was a teenager then, wasn't at home, and we got a message that we needed to go. We needed to go to the hospital because something had happened. So we went to the hospital, and it turned out that he'd done some stupid thing and he'd poured flaming shots on his face and could have easily blinded himself, but didn't. And so, we took care of him, and he had to stay there for a while. And then we went home, and I called up my mother, and I said, Mom, this is what happened with Jake. And she sort of listened to me, and then she sort of sighed, and she said, well, that's nothing compared to what you and your brother put us through. And I thought, okay, she has a point there.
It's all perspective.
Yeah, right. So I think it was tough for them.
Well, one thing I wondered about was, your mom was involved with politics in the county, I think in New York, and she even ran for Congress twice.
Yeah.
Once when she was 70, like around your age.
Yeah, right.
Which is amazing. So I thought, well, would they be thinking on some level, hey, at least Bo's taking a stand about something?
No.
No.
Well, it was a difficult time for them because the FBI was all over the place. They'd come out in the morning and all the garbage would be stacked up next to the garbage can, and neatly stacked up next to the garbage can.
But your mom was used to the FBI being around.
Well, that gets into a whole other story. But, once there was I think a Democratic primary or something like that, and she was the state committee woman for the Democratic Party, and Lisa and I were there, and when they were sort of counting the votes and everything, and she. We went there, and this was the FBI was there, and they sort of stood in the back of the room, and I knew they were there, and I looked at one of her friends, and I said, that's the FBI back there, and they're going to keep an eye on me. He said, he sort of looked back, he said, no, you're exaggerating. I said, no, that's what it is. And he said, look, I'll tell you something. If we go out of here and I get in your car and you start to drive someplace, they will not let you out of their sight. They have a homing device on my mother's car, but they obviously don't have one on your car, so they're going to want to keep you in sight. He said, no. And I said, yes, that's what's going to happen. He said, well, okay, let's go do that. So we got up and we went outside and we got into his car, and he started to drive off. And sure enough, all these cars started to follow him, and he went sort of racing around Rockland County, which is where I lived, in all these back roads and everything, and they never let him out of their sight. So he said, well, I guess you're right. And I said, yeah, I know I'm right. And that was actually before my actual indictment. That was when, I think at that point, they were thinking that, well, one thing I know for sure is they thought I was a much bigger deal than I was. And that was because their informant was somebody who I knew quite well. And when the indictment came down, he was one of the people who was indicted, but he was an informant, and he'd been an informant the whole time. So I don't know. I I think I was not like a big deal in this organization,
Yeah.
but I think they thought I was because I'd spent so much time with this guy. And certainly if they were going to have a trial and he was going to testify at it, he was going to wind up testifying a lot about spending time with me.
Mm-hmm.
Any event, I will tell you this, is that it was a long road after that. And as I said, I'd been the editor of this radical magazine, Ramparts, in the early 1970s. And then, Ramparts eventually went under, and Lisa and I wound up moving back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we'd been before. She wanted to go to nursing school, and that was fine. And I had to get a job, so there were jobs there that I could get, writing jobs, and one thing led to the other, and eventually I got to a point where we actually had two children, and because we had a daughter was born in 1977, and I was freelance writing at the time, and freelance writing was feast or famine, mainly famine, and I realized, I really have to get a real job here. I can't keep going on like this. And so I got approached by a headhunter who said that Fidelity Investments was looking for a writer. And I said, well, they don't want me. I don't know the difference between a stock and the bond. She said, no, they can teach you all that stuff. They just want somebody who can write. I said, all right, well, I'll go in for an interview. So I went in for an interview, and they wound up hiring me. And I was there for about a year, and then I got a call from a friend who I knew who was a writer who worked at Boston Magazine. And then he switched to this startup in Boston called Inc. Magazine. And he said that Inc. Magazine was hiring and that they were looking for writers who had a background in sort of general interest magazine writing, which I had. They would, I think you should come in and talk to them because I think they'd like to hire you. And I said, well, I'll come in and talk to them. And sure enough, I wound up getting hired to go work at Inc. Magazine. And I started there in January of 1983. And I was there very early on. It must have been it was after an issue came out because my name was on the masthead. And I got a call from somebody who basically said, is this Bo Burlingham? I said, yes, it is. He said, are you the same Bo Burlingham who was an editor at Ramparts 10 years ago? And I said, yeah, that's me, same one. And he said, that figures. Ramparts in the 70s, Inc. Magazine in the 80s. That's sort of where the world's going. And I said, well, you're not wrong about that. Here I am. But that was sort of really the beginning. I mean, first working at Fidelity and then working at Inc. really began to sort of challenge a lot of ideas that I'd had before, which I basically realized they were wrong. That a lot of what I had thought before and had been pretty confident about, I mean, I sounded like you know, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and I was as convinced in what it in. I was convinced I was I just like these kids now, you know, I was every bit convinced that I was absolutely right, and that began to get chipped away as I went out into the world, and particularly when I was at Inc. magazine, and I began to meet people who really sort of made me sort of see things in an entirely different way. And you know, that's a journey I've been on.
Well, the important thing is you were open to it.
I guess. I mean, you know, I always had the idea that I'm interested in, you know, I mean, if you're a journalist, I had this sort of idealistic idea of what journalism was, which is that we want to write about what's true. I mean, that our obligation is to our readers, and we want to write the truth. And, well, when you have that sort of way, you sort of wind up questioning not only the people you're interviewing, the people you're writing about, you wind up questioning yourself. And you say, well, is this true? I mean, this is not what I thought. And there were a lot of steps to it. And and I, it was an evolution, and it happened over, you know, a fairly extended period of time. And it was particularly the people I met who were, you know, a lot entrepreneurs, mainly entrepreneurs, who made me realize I had this sort of naive notion about jobs, for example. And what I realized was that, you know, jobs don't just appear out of nowhere, and the government doesn't create jobs. That in fact, it takes a lot of work to create a job, and that that you had to sort of respect people who had actually done that, because before they'd done it, they'd had to take a lot of risks, and they could have been wrong. But they went through and they began hiring people. You know, I began to learn about how the very fundamental things in an economy work. Like, where do jobs come from? How do companies get built? Where do big companies come from? And, you know, I was sort of right there where, and there were a lot of things that sort of challenged my thinking. I mean, I began, when I got to Inc., I began to run into these companies, a lot of which were doing some very interesting things with their employees. I mean, they were, you know, setting up employee stock ownership. They were, they were treating their employees in a way that was very different from other companies, and and the thing that sort of really struck me was a lot of these people were Republicans. They were basically conservative people, but who had this idea about. In fact, I had friends who were liberals who started companies who in the way they run their companies were very regressive. And I mean, I had a friend who started a company, and it was pretty successful. And I asked if he ever thought about employee ownership in his company. He just sort of, it was like, where did that idea come from? What a stupid idea that is. And, he ostensibly was a very left-wing person, but when it actually came to running his company, he was not bringing any progressive ideas to bear on it. So, I don't know. I don't have no idea what you're going to do with this, Rob.
You always say those things. Well, there's many people out there that are interested because you're so humble about everything, which, of course, is part of one of the many reasons so many people love you dearly, myself at the forefront of that. But you've made a big difference on the way people think. I like to tell this story to the new team members and existing team members at my company at the first time I met you, and connecting the dots that, when I was in high school reading Inc. magazine and I couldn't wait for it to come. It was my favorite magazine. That you were the editor at that time.
Well, I was an editor. There were several editors, and I was one of them.
Fair enough. But to be able to, connect with you later in life and know that, you were part of something that was having a deep impact in my mindset. And same thing with Small Giants. That had such a big impact, and that's how we ultimately ended up meeting.
Yeah. Well, we met at Zingerman's.
We met at Zingerman's, and I was explaining to you the story of the sale and the buyback of my company.
Right.
Which sounds more impressive than it is, as you know, but...
no, I think it's pretty impressive.
Well, all things are relative, I suppose, but, you had this deep curiosity about it. And, we had this offer to buy back the company, which we weren't really sure we wanted to do. And somehow or another, I got the book sent to me. I don't even know how that happened. I still don't know. And I just kind of was flipping through it, saw Zingerman's in there, and that caught my attention because I grew up loving Zingerman's and how they do their business, and I read the book and we decided this is the way we want to do things. So that's how impactful it was.
Well, I mean that has, for me, hearing stories like that's the reward of writing. That when it turns out that somebody actually got some value out of what you wrote. Because, the truth is that when I'm in the middle of writing a book, I have no idea whether it's any good or not.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I'm frequently asking myself, is anybody as interested in this as I am? And that's why I really rely on an editor to sort of tell me, yes, this is interesting, or maybe you don't have to go on quite so long, or whatever.
Yeah.
I depend on an editor to sort of give me some perspective. So and then when the book comes out, obviously I have high hopes for it, but I don't know until I begin to hear from readers, whether or not it's having an impact. And,
well, I mean, certainly, at this point with Small Giants and Finish Big, even now kind of, I see, the flywheel spinning with that. But, I wonder if you're ever at these summits that Small Giants has, and even now with the relationship with Forbes, and it seems as though companies are clamoring to get on this list now. Do you ever reflect and think, geez, like this all happened because of this book I wrote?
Well, no, I never look at it that way. It's like, what is happening here? What happened?
Surreal.
Yeah, but it's really, I'm very keenly aware that something like the Small Giants community and the Small Giants Summit are, in fact, the work of people other than me. And, you know, the thing that, I mean, I'm glad that the book has inspired them to do all this great stuff. But you know, that's something they've decided to do. You know, you look at somebody like Hemza, you know, I wonder, you know, what motivates her? You know, what is it? She must have her own relationship to all this stuff that is independent of me. And, you know, I have, you know, just tremendous respect for the work that she's done. And people, you know, I think sometimes people think that I've done it. And that I find sort of embarrassing, because I know perfectly well that I haven't done it. All I did was write a book.
Well, you were the spark, you know,
yeah,
you're
I guess
the inspiration.
So.
And Hemza, by the way, for those that don't know, is the executive director of Small Giants, and Paul Spiegelman is the founder, along with yourself.
You've done an interview with Hemza, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Did you do Paul?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
So they you know, go back and listen to those episodes if you're interested. Hemza's story is really amazing, and Paul is, you know, embodiment of a small giant. You know, thank goodness. I have a friendship with him. He's been so instrumental in my life.
Uh-huh.
As we wrap up here, I want to ask you a question about obviously something that I'm very passionate about, which is meditation. And you've had a long time meditation practice with, which some people know about, many people don't. I'm curious about what impact that's had on your life and why it's important to you.
Well, it's had a huge impact on my life. I mean, I sort of got it started, as you know, and as I write about in the introduction to Do Nothing, I sort of wound up starting to meditate by accident. And but it became clear to me so fast, so in such a short period of time, that this was actually very important to my health and to my state of mind, that you know, and we're talking like, I don't know, 35, 40 years ago, and that I became and still am sort of very dependent on it. And well, I'm sure this happens to you as well. I frequently run into people who are struggling with something or other, and the thought that pops into me, I said, well, you need to take up meditation. And, you know, the truth is, I do a form of meditation, namely transcendental meditation, made famous by the Beatles, I guess, that is really only one form, and there are many others. I mean, Lisa, my wife, meditates. She does all different kinds besides transcendental. She does these guided meditations, which was sort of like what we did at the retreat. And the retreat was great, by the way. You know, the retreat was great, and I had never done anything like it, and I really enjoyed it, and I really got a lot out of it, and I would urge everyone to go on one of Rob's retreats, because it was really a very special experience.
Well, it was special to have you there.
Well,
without question. Just your presence meant a lot, not only to myself, but to the many people around.
Well,
yeah.
Once again, cool. You're being much too generous to me, Rob. But I was the one who was the main beneficiary of it.
That's great. Well, Bo, thank you for coming all the way from Oakland over into the city here in San Francisco and spending time with me on my podcast. You've had such an impact on me over my life. It's meant the world to me. I really love you deeply.
Well,
and
I love you too, Rob.
Thank
and,
you.
I have to say, you inspire me.
Oh, thank you.
You do. Because I love to see what you're doing with your life and where it's taken you. And, I was interested in that well before Do Nothing happened. And, I do have some questions, which I was thinking about today.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make money on Do Nothing?
You don't. But if it ever happens, I'll let you know.
Well, shouldn't we be paying something for all of this?
At some point, hopefully.
Okay.
But at this point, I'm just hoping to put quality work into the world.
Well, you are.
And I've been fortunate that, I have a supportive business partner and a healthy business that allows us to do this.
Oh,
and,
well, that's great.
Hopefully good things will come from the universe.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking. Thanks again for being here, Bo.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure, Rob.
And to all the listeners, thank you for listening to the Do Nothing podcast with Bo Burlingham, an amazing person, an inspiration to so many of us. And I wish you all love and kindness.